All right, guys, this is the third of our three training videos. In this one, we're finally going to get into the forms and the general clinic processes. One thing I always point out to people is we are now well over an hour and a half into this training, and we're just now starting to talk about the forms. That is because a lot of the other things we've talked about are as important as filling out the forms. I think you guys will find through this video and through your experiences in the clinic that it's pretty easy to get decent at filling out the forms. But the things that will really set you apart and the skills you want to be able to learn and the things that will make this whole process easier are when you are able to, again, have those great client interviewing skills, be able to do some issue spotting and things. So we're going to go through the forms, and I'm not going to pretend they're not important because this is our work product at the end. But definitely don't discount all the things that we have talked about rather, up until this point. So doing a quick jump, the first thing we're going to do is talk a bit about the client flow through the MJC. And so with the client flow through the MJC, I'm just going to quickly explain like sort of the process that you go through when you are working with a client, all the different steps you're going to do. And then we will talk about some of those major steps in a series of videos that will all be stitched into this video, although I think you guys will probably be able to see the places where there are different recordings. See like each piece sort of in a little more detail. So in the beginning, when you are first assigned a client, you're going to be given a fact-finding sheet from the supervisor, and they'll give you any notes they know about the case or the client situation. After that, you're going to go back to your station, your physical station, and you're going to check Salesforce to see if the client has an existing profile. If they do, you're going to pull up any visit notes from the last 6 months to see if there's info you need to know. If they don't have a profile, you're going to start a new profile for them. Next, you're going to go out and get the client. You get them from our physical waiting room, and you get them by calling them by name. Sometimes they're going to have names you're not sure about. One technique you can use is if you're fairly sure about one name but not the other, so you don't know how to pronounce the first name but you're confident in the last name of Smith, you know, Mr. Smith or Miss Smith. If you're really not sure, take your best stab at the name. Make sure you speak loudly, because a lot of times students will come back and say, my client's not here, and then when we go out and say the name louder, folks can hear you, so make sure you project. Once you've grabbed the client, you're going to bring them back to your station, and then you're going to complete the Salesforce profile. If they already had a profile, you're going to make updates or edits needed. If they didn't have a profile, you're going to create one with them. Next, once you're done with the profile and going through the scope of service, you will fill out the fact-finding sheet. As I mentioned earlier in the training, and as I will mention again when we talk about the fact-finding sheet, fill out the whole sheet, even if you think you've identified a potential problem. The only time that isn't true is, again, if your fact-finding sheet is, say, part 1, and you realize you need a post-judgment or something like that. Speaking of post-judgment, if you're dealing with a post-judgment case, after you're done with the fact-finding sheet, that's when you're going to go to the internal CCAP to take a look at that most recent court order and make sure you have that information for your fact-finding sheet. Once you have finished with internal CCAP, if you're doing a post-judgment, or once you've finished with the just the intake sheet, the fact-finding sheet with a divorce client, you're going to check in with the supervisor. That's true even if you know what form you think you're going to need. That's true no matter what. You're going to check in with the supervisor at this point just to confirm you're on the right track and there aren't any potential problems. Again, it's not that we don't trust you, but sometimes we're going to know a little more than you do. And so there might be a hidden problem you're not aware of that we can identify from the information you're going to bring us. Once you've checked in, you're going to know what forms you want to do because that's something you'll talk about with the supervisor. So you're going to go and complete the forms with the client. Once you have done that, filled out the forms, you're going to physically print a copy of the forms and take them to the supervisor for review. A lot of you, being the budding environmentalists that you are going to want us to come and look at it on the computer. All of us have elderly eyeballs. We cannot squint and see the screen. And also sometimes we like to be able to talk to you about things that we see that we maybe can't bring up in front of the client, things that might constitute legal advice, but that might be interesting information for you. So print a copy and you're going to bring it to the supervisor. The supervisor will go through it with you, and during that review, they'll probably have some changes that they'll mark for you. You're going to go back to your station and make changes that the supervisor recommends. If they said you should come back to them after you make changes, you're going to go back to the supervisor. But once you've gotten a satisfactory set of documents, the supervisor said you're good, then you're going to take the documents back to the client. You're going to get them to sign everything. If something needs to be notarized, you'll wait until a notary's there to get them to sign it. Then you're going to make photocopies of everything for the client. You will then walk the client through the filing directions, and then you will walk the client out of the clinic space. Again, a temptation is going to be to say bye, the door's over there, but make sure you do walk with them. Sometimes clients get lost in our space and they end up in the wrong place. And again, this is part of that confidentiality prong. We do have access to confidential information. One of the ways we keep that information secure is by escorting clients to and from locations in the clinic itself. Once your client has left, you still need to complete your post-visit Salesforce notes. And then once you're done with that, you can go up to the supervisor and get another client. So that's the basic flow through the clinic. And now let's get into some more specifics about each of the major steps. So the first step in our process is pretty simple. It's be given a fact-finding sheet. So obviously you don't have to do a lot other than stand there and receive the document. But I do want to draw your attention to some things that will be on the fact-finding sheet when you first get it. So when you first get the fact-finding questionnaire, as it's called, or the fact-finding sheet as we usually call them, it is going to have a handwritten name and usually a birthday at the top. So our sample client we're going to be working with today is Susie, sample MJC forms, and we have a birthday. This is information that, one, tells you, of course, the name of the client you're going to go call, but also will be helpful in Salesforce, which will be the next thing that we look at. So you'll have those two pieces of information. The other thing you can gather very quickly, just from which fact-finding sheet you're given, is what kind of case it is. So you can see for our practice in this training, we're going to be going through a post-judgment situation, a post-judgment form, but we also have fact-finding sheets where it might say divorce part 1 here, divorce part 2, a name change. So it sort of gives you the general category type of case that you're in. Obviously, when we fill out the fact-finding sheet, we'll look more at the questions here. But just in the initial, I've received my fact-finding sheet, those are the main things you want to look at. And then you will take this fact-finding sheet that has been given to you by a supervisor, and you will go back to your cube, your computer here at the MJC, and you will sit down with this and go to Salesforce. So when you return to your station, you're going to pull up Salesforce. At our clinic stations, you should be in Firefox. I know it's annoying because if those of you who are super tech savvy will notice that I am in Chrome for this video. But at our clinic stations, you do need to be in Firefox. The computer we use to record our trainings doesn't have Firefox, so that's why I'm doing this in Chrome. But again, you should be in Firefox. When you pull up Firefox, you'll have two save tabs. One is the MJC Forms site, the internal forms site. And the internal forms site is where we will get our documents to fill out and things like that. So we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But right now, once you've gotten your fact-finding sheet and you're back at your station, what we're interested in is Salesforce. So Salesforce is this program here. If when you sit down at your station it's not logged in, the passwords are saved, so you can just hit log in. And again, as long as you're in Firefox, it will have that automatically saved. It'll log you in. So this is the landing page for Salesforce. Now, as you may recall, I have got my client's name, Susie Sample, MJC Forms, and a birthday. So you can search for a client up here in the upper section here. I often search by just first name or just last name. So for example, I might search for Sample MJC Forms. Because Susie, again, is it Susie? Is it Susan? So that's why I might do it that way. Sometimes if someone has a really common name, so you might say, hey, this person has got a super common name, it's John Smith. Then you might just put John Smith. But if you're having trouble finding someone, try breaking it down by each name. And you can see, shock of shocks, Susie Sample MJC Forms already has a profile. It's not shocking because this is one of our sample people. And when I do this search and I see that the name has come up, I also want to check the birthday and make sure that lines up. Because again, I don't know that it's super likely, but I guess it's possible that you could have two Susie Sample MJC Forms out in the world. So I double check 1900. So Susie is very old. We take a look here. Yep, it is that same 123-year-old listed right here. Great. So we go ahead and open the client profile. So if you search the name and it comes up, great. You can pull up that profile and you are ready to go grab the client. But what happens if we didn't come up with something? So let's say I searched the name. I'm not going to run a search just because this is the actual database and we talked about client confidentiality, so you guys know that I can't in my training video show the information for real clients. I can obviously show for the fictional person, Susie Sample, MJC Forms, but if I run a search, you will see actual client information. But let's assume I ran the search for Susie and it didn't come up with anything. So when I was, so when I ran that search, it didn't come up. Then what I can do is, so I've searched by her first name, last name, I'm not finding anything. Then what you'll do is you'll hit create new intake. Remember, you don't want to do a search with the client sitting here with you. So that's why you want to do all this before they come back here, because just like I can't search with you on this video because I might find client information and accidentally reveal it, you don't want to search with the client because they'll see the people in the list. So anyway, you'll pull up this new intake form that can be filled out with the client's information. So at this point, you are ready to go get the clients. You're going to go out of the clinic. You're going to loudly call the client by name, and then you're going to bring them back to your station. All right, so at this point, you have checked Salesforce, you have gone out, you have gotten the client, you are sitting face to face with a real human person. The first thing you're going to do when they sit down is introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Kyla. I'll be helping you today. Obviously don't use that name, use your name. But you'll sit down, you'll tell them your name. And then the next thing you're going to do is go through our scope of service. So I transition to that usually by saying, hi, I'm Kyla. I'm going to be helping you out today. Before we get started on your forms, we just have a couple of administrative things we need to do. First, I'm going to walk you through our scope of service, and then we'll do a quick profile. And then we can get started on the forms. If people ask, well, why do we have to do this? The scope of service just explains what services we're providing, and it makes sure that the client is okay with the terms of our service. So that's why we have to go through that. We do it with everyone. Some folks may tell you, I already heard this, I've been here before. You have to do it every time. And so you can just say, great, I'll try and make it quick, but I'm going to go through it. So then this is the scope of service. A lot of people will just read the scope of service. That's fine. So you could read it bullet point by bullet point. You could say, okay, make sure that I guess I would change it from I to you, because I as if the client is reading it. But you understand that you're acting as your own attorney. You understand that it may be wise to get your own attorney, and it is your choice whether or not to do so. The MJC, staff, and volunteers can only provide procedural information and help with preparing legal paperwork. The staff and volunteers must be neutral and may help me and the other person on the other side of my case. I further understand that the person helping me doesn't represent me. They are not providing me legal advice, and there is no attorney-client relationship. I understand that I'm completely responsible for the accuracy and completeness of my paperwork and should review any forms before filing them. Our new versions, I believe, don't say by signing. This is, again, a slightly outdated version, but at the end it's saying, I acknowledge that I have had this that I've read this or had this read to me, and I understand it fully. So that's as simple as that. What you may get used to doing once you've been in our clinics for a little bit and you're really familiar with this sheet is you may start to paraphrase it. So for example, I might go through and say, this is just saying you're acting as your own attorney. It might be a good idea to get an attorney, but it's up to you whether or not you do so. The MJC staff and volunteers can only give you procedural information, so that means we are not able to give you legal advice. If you do need legal advice, we have some referral information we can give you. Down here, staff and volunteers may be neutral or must be neutral, and that means that we can help you today. If the other person in your case comes in and asks for help, we can help them as well. Down here, you're saying you understand that I don't represent you and that there isn't an attorney-client relationship between us. You are still responsible for the completeness and accuracy of your forms, so make sure that you review everything I'm doing as we work on the computer today so that you know what the forms say and you can make sure they're accurate because the court will rely on that information. Right, so those two things are basically the same. When I read it and when I just kind of was paraphrasing as I went, you got the same information. And so it is okay to paraphrase. What you don't want to do with the scope of service is say, here, do you understand this? We do want you to actually go through it with them because what happens is people don't read it, right? Think about the last time you got some software and it said, hey, before you download this, please read all these terms. Did you read them? No, of course not. You just checked at the bottom and said, yep, that's fine, whatever. Just let me download my program. Let me upload my game. Let me do whatever it is I want to do. Clients are the same way. They're not going to read this. But some of this is important information. We want to make it clear that they understand that you are not their lawyer. Indeed, you can tell them. A lot of our students will start off by saying, I'm just a student volunteer helping you fill out forms, so I can't be your lawyer. Totally fine. We want to make sure, especially, that they know about the accuracy and completeness. We'll get people who come back and they'll say, my volunteer, John Doe, made a typo. And we'll be like, yeah, that's a bummer. Did you review the forms? They'll be like, no. Well, our scope of service says you need to review the forms. So, important information. This document is located at each station. Many stations will have 2 copies, and that's so that you can read one and present the other to the client. But do make sure that you go through it bullet point by bullet point with them. Don't just say, take a look at this. How does it look? So then, once you are done with the scope of service, you are going to turn back to Salesforce. So when you turn back to Salesforce on the computer, because the intake sheet is a physical piece of paper that you've been reviewing with the client, you've now turned your attention back to the computer. The Salesforce site is obviously going to be exactly as you left it. So if you had pulled up the client's intake, you'll be looking at their intake. If you'd pulled up a blank one, you're going to be looking at the blank one. Since earlier in this video, we were looking at the blank one, we're going to start off with filling out a new profile, but then I will go back and show you what we would do if we were just editing a profile. So obviously we are going to start off. Now we have the client's name on our fact-finding sheet. A lot of people will take this name as the gospel. Don't do that, because at our front desk, people are talking quickly. Sometimes it's hard to hear. They're taking their best guess at somebody's name, but we might have it wrong. And so back here, you want to make sure you have it right. So for your name, looks like your name is Susie. Is that S-U-S-I-E? And you can hear I spelled it out. And I know that seems tedious, especially when the name is like, John Smith. And you're like, I know how to do this. I know how to spell this. But you may not. We get names that are spelled differently than you might think. Again, our front desk maybe made a mistake on our intake sheet. So you're like, oh, great. I know what their name is. But you're going to go through it with them, and you want to make sure you're spelling it out. because we want to make sure we're getting names and information right. And so it looks like your last name is Sample, Sample, and a hyphen, and then MJC, Forms, Forms. Does that look right? Right, so we want to be constantly checking in to make sure we're getting things correct for this database here. All right, and then what is your birthday? And the client, so again, notice I'm asking the question to the client. Some people will look at this and they'll go, date of birth, and you can do that, but I like to make it a little bit more of a conversation, a little bit more of like questions. So I'm going to put in the birthday that the client gives me. And then you can skip the text message one, the survey one. Under phone number, I usually say, what's your phone number? And then I usually put it in the cell phone one, so they give it to me, and I enter their phone number, and then I just double check, and I say, and is that a cell phone or a landline? And if they say, oh, actually, that's a landline, you can just highlight it and copy paste it down a level, right? And then you're still set. So that's how I do that. You may approach it differently, but that's how you're going to do it. You're going to get the email address from the client. And again, email address is a great one where you need to spell it out again. Okay, so it sounds like your email is mjcdivorce, divorce, @gmail.com. Does that look right? And notice I'm doing both. I'm spelling it out and I'm saying, does that look right? Clients are often very distracted. They're not paying attention to you. They think you've got it. That's great. We're glad they have confidence in you, but 2 checks, right? So you spelled it, so there's a chance for them to hear you if you have it wrong. And does that look right? A chance they may glance up and say, no, that doesn't look right. Next, we're going to put in their information. And at this point, or even before this, you may get some people who are wanting to know, well, why do you need this information? And what we tell them is, this is demographic information for us. It helps us if we ever need to contact you for some reason. So if there were an issue with the forms or something like that. It also helps us keep track of who we've helped so we can take notes. If you ever come back in the future, someone will be able to see what we worked on, and that way they'll be able to hit the ground running. And I do need to collect this information, but it's not given to the courts. It's just something that our organization uses. So we have the address here. And you may see that the default city is Milwaukee. You can change that. It's just the vast majority of folks are from Milwaukee. But, if Susie were from one of the suburbs, so maybe she's from Glendale, that's, totally fine to change that. And you can also change the state. So if she were from Glendale, Arizona, instead of Glendale, Wisconsin, you can change it there too. So you can completely change those. You just want to, it just defaults to Milwaukee. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to Glendale, Wisconsin, because I do not know the zip code for Glendale, Arizona. 539, I think. Okay, so you've got this information. So the information on the left is required. You can see you can save it with only a name, but please don't do that because it's very hard to keep track of these profiles if they don't have at least a name and a birth date. So you've filled in that side. The side on the right, this is demographic information. And again, I say this to the client. This is demographic information. This is stuff that helps us keep track of who we're helping. Sometimes we use it. It's not associated with your name at all, but we use it to get an idea of generally who we're helping and to go, look, we're helping folks who are low income, or, we're helping women or whatever, so that we can request funding and, reports like that nonprofits need to do. And so these are optional. And again, speaking now to you, my student friend, these are optional. I usually tell folks, if you're uncomfortable with the question, just say skip it and we can skip that one. So here, what is your gender? You go through, you'll pick the closest from those categories. Occasionally you'll have people that are like, what? You don't know? And you can say, yep, I just have to go through the questions. And so you'll pick, Susie will say is female. What would you say is your race or gender? It looks like I've got some options here. American, and often people will just say, oh, it's it's mixed, or it is, you know, it is white or Caucasian, or it is whatever. So, you'll pick whatever one. If they say, none of those fit me, or I prefer to skip it, you'll just skip that one. You'll put their marital status. So, divorced, married, separated, single, or widowed. And then you'll also indicate whether they receive any of these. And often people ask one by one, they go, do you get Badger Care? And I often just say, like, do you receive any public assistance like Badger Care, Food Share? And then often they'll say, yeah, I get Badger Care and Food Share. Great, you've got both those. If they say yes, then you have to say, okay, do you get Badger Care, Food Share? Which ones do you get? So you'll just move as many of those, and you can also just double click on it. It'll also move over. So you'll do as many of those as apply. Down here, housing. Do you rent? Do you own? Do you stay with family and friends? Do you do something different? So we'll say Susie rents. How many adults, including you, live in your household? And maybe it's 2. How many minor children live in your household? And we'll say that's 2 as well. What would you estimate is your household income before taxes? This is something you'll get a lot of questions about. Folks are like, what does that mean? Generally it is looking for the household income, but a lot of people don't know that. So they live with their mom and they don't know how much money their mom makes, or they, they're couch surfing or what have you. So it's also okay if they just tell you what their gross monthly income is. If they know the household one, fantastic. But otherwise, if they're like, well, I make, $1,200 a month. Okay, great. So we have that estimated amount. And you can always, sometimes people will try to get really specific with this, and they'll be like trying to get it down to the penny. I always show them this little drop down, and I say, you can see it just wants a general estimate, kind of goes by $500 increments. So that way they know they don't, like, people will try to be like, it's 1251. Oh, is it 07 or 08? And you're like, I don't care about that. So that's one way to kind of show them that, yeah, we just need the broad range. Do you currently have paid employment? Do you have, a job, a paid job? Yes or no. And then you'll click here if they're a veteran or if they're active duty in the military. Then you're going to save all that. I am not going to save all that because, as you guys know from watching this video, Susie already has a profile. But again, you're going to hit save. And when you hit save, so I'm actually going to hit save because I know what it's going to do. It indicates, there are some duplicates. And it's like, so sometimes you'll get a duplicate message when there's nothing problematic about it, right? So it's a phone number, and maybe a previous client had that phone number. Now this client has that phone number. Maybe they live with somebody and they're using the same phone number. So often this can be fine. You would obviously, again, if this weren't a video, I would click on that to check and see, is it the same person? Since you're sitting with the client, you'll usually need to turn the screen so that they can't see it when you're checking these conflicts. But that could come up. So again, I'm going to cancel because one of these actually is Susie, and a few of them are some of our other samples. So you go ahead. If you realize, I've made a duplicate, you hit cancel. All right. So then let's go back and do what we would do to edit Susie's form. So as you guys know, Susie already, no MJC forms. Susie already had a profile. So if this were a real client, we wouldn't have made that profile from scratch. We would have started with this. And so you can see we have Susie's information here. And I usually just do a quick run through and I say, is this all still accurate? Is your phone number still this number that ends in 5555? Your email still mjcdivorce@gmail.com? Are you still over on Main Street? And then if this demographic section hasn't been filled out, that's when you could say, great, let's go ahead and fill in the demographic information. Looks like maybe they didn't have the demographic info the last time you were here. Or you can check and see, you can say, it looks like the demographic information isn't filled out. Would you be willing to provide that information? If so, you can fill it in. You'll make any changes. So again, if Susie says, I actually don't live on Main Street anymore, I live over on East Street, you can just double click on it. It opens it up, and then we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, West East Street. And maybe that has a new zip code. It's 53207. Right, so we can do that, make those changes. Because I know you guys are tired of watching me type, we're going to pretend that Susie said she doesn't want to enter her gender information or her demographic information. So we're just going to hit save here. And you can see it has updated that information. And then we now have all the Salesforce info. So it's time to turn our attention back to that fact-finding sheet. So after you're done going through the scope of service and making the Salesforce profile, you are ready to go through the fact-finding questionnaire with your client. And you'll see, just like some of the Salesforce, this is written as if, like, it's asking you. So, right, which topics does the client want to address in their motion? When you are asking these questions to the client, you're going to want to frame them as if you are asking them. Because I will certainly see people who say, which topics does the client want to address? And then they'll stare at the client like, which topics does the client want? And the client doesn't realize you're talking to them because they don't think of themselves as the client. And so again, you sort of turn these and phrase them as if you're just having a conversation, you're asking the question. So what topics are you wanting to address with your motion? And if they've, so sorry, let me start again from the top. So our first question that I'm going to ask the client is, I'm going to say, great, why don't you tell me just a couple sentences or a little bit about what brings you here today? What would you like to accomplish? You can see my phrasing wasn't exactly the same as the question. That's okay as long as we get to the point. So if you want, again, I could have said, great, why don't you please just provide me a brief description of your issue? What brings you here today? Same sentence. So sort of you adapt it to suit you. You will want to take a couple of notes here. Your notes don't have to be full sentences. They can be, and that's fine. Remember, you'll be handwriting. I'm obviously going to type, but you'll be handwriting this. And you're just going to put, so if the client says, well, I have been working down at the Chevy plant for a long time, but there have been layoffs. And so I got laid off on Thursday, but the great news is I have this bum hip anyway. So I think that it's probably going to be good for me to, take a job where I'm going to have less hours, and, I'm going to start working at, over at, the new dealership on Friday. That it's like they've talked about a lot of things. And so then you can prompt a little bit and say, okay, well, so, what is it you're wanting to do? And they might say, oh, well, I don't want to pay as much child support anymore because I can't afford that. And I want to see my kid more. So you don't have to write that whole, so that's a big chunk of text, right? You don't have to draft that and go, got laid off from the show. You don't have to necessarily do that. I could just narrow it down to, okay, he wants to, or she, because it's Susie, Susie wants to lower child support and get more placement time. You can include facts or things that you think are important. So if you're like, got laid off, and you're that, I think that's interesting or important, you can include that. But basically here, we're getting at what is their goal? What do they want to do? So then this next one, sometimes you'll have to ask, because if Susie had used that first paragraph, that kind of rambling thing I did where I was like, I got laid off and then this, but the good news is now I can stay home more with my bum hip. That's when you might want to say, okay, great. So what topics from your court case are you wanting to address? If Susie's been more specific up here and said, I want to lower my child support and I want to see my child more, then you might be able to, I don't know why Susie has that accent, by the way, but she does. Anyway, so if she's been more specific, you may be able to answer this without necessarily asking it. So she said, I want to, do child support, and she says, I want custody of my kid. You, of course, will say, custody means decision-making power, or, custody in Wisconsin means decision-making power. Did you want to talk about decision making, where your child lives, or both of those things? Or again, your version of that statement. And then you'll clarify. Almost certainly she means placement, but maybe she also wants to talk about decision making power. She's like, yeah, I would like to change that aspect of it. So you're going to highlight or circle, because you'll be doing this by hand, circle, 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 as many things as you think the client wants to address. Again, be really careful about arrears payment versus arrears balances. If you're not sure, I always, like, if somebody says, well, I want to deal with arrears, and I say, great, do you want to deal with how much you are paying or how much the other person is paying towards arrears, or are you wanting to get rid of the whole balance, the total amount owed? And then they can sort of let you know which they're thinking about. What I typically don't do, what some people will do, is they'll say, do you want to talk about child support? Do you want to talk about placement? Do you want to talk about custody? Do you want to talk about taxes? You can do that, I suppose, but it's much easier to just get it from the narrative they've given you, or to say, what is it you're wanting to address? Because then sometimes you'll say, well, do you want to address arrears balances? And they'll go, I do. Yeah, let's do that. And then it turns out it's a situation where maybe they can't. And so we spend this time dealing with an issue that they didn't even come in thinking about. So, personal preference, and you'll get more granular in how you want to do this. But I typically stick with what they've said they want to talk about. This line, number 3, you do not need to ask the client. It is funny because a lot of people do this and they'll be like, do you want to change or enforce your order? This isn't really something the client will know. This is an analysis point for you. So I want you as a student, after you have heard where they say, I want to lower my child support and I want to get more placement time. And we know they want to talk about child support, placement, and custody. I want you to analyze, are they wanting to change their order or are they wanting to enforce their order? So change, pretty simple. They don't like their existing order and they want something about it to be different. Enforce means they love their existing order, or at the very least they tolerate it, but they want the other person to follow it. So with change, the problem is I don't like my order, I want it to be different. With enforce, the problem is my order is fine, but the other person isn't following the order like they're supposed to. So this is something that you are going to analyze. So you don't need to read this out loud to the client. You just need to go, okay, are they trying to change or enforce? In the beginning, this may be really difficult and you may not be sure. If you're not sure, you can just sort of go with your best guess. So I might say, I think she's trying to change. I'm not sure, but it sounds like change to me. Take your best guess. And then when you talk with a supervisor, like I might put if I were writing this, I might put a little star here to remind myself when I talk to the supervisor for my check-in to say, I think it's change, but I'm not sure. And then they can help you clarify to see whether it's change or enforce. Back to number 4, we are again asking the client this information. So do you think the other person would agree to this change you want to make? Do you think they would sign off on a form? And what I find happens with this question a lot is people say, well, I don't know, I don't talk to them. And so then you go, okay, maybe. But this is one of those drill down a little deeper moments where if they say like, yeah, I think they would, great. So you think they would sign a form, and then hopefully they'll say yes. Or they'll say, no, I don't think they would. Great, we're pretty cleanly in either category. But if they say, well, I don't know, I don't talk to them, then I would say, well, do you think they would sign a form? Would you be able to get them a form? And do you think you would agree and that they'd be able to sign it? And often they'll say, no, like we don't talk. And then you can go, okay, so it sounds like you don't think that you guys would be able to like work out an agreement between you, right? And so then they say no. And so then I've reached a clearer answer than maybe, right? Sometimes the answer will be maybe. Sometimes you're going to get people who say, I don't know. We talked about it, but sometimes I think we agree and then we don't. And they're really going to end up in this kind of like they're not certain. That's fine. That's why the maybe option is there. But just make sure if it is a situation where the reason why they're saying maybe kind of sounds like yes or no, and it's more commonly going to be no. Again, the most common one is going to be, they're going to say, well, I don't know because I haven't talked to them in 10 years and we have a restraining order between us. That's, that again, you could check maybe, but I think that's a good time to be like, am I understanding it correctly that you wouldn't be able to contact them to work out an agreement? In which case you might be in no, because here we really are looking at, is the other person willing and able to sign forms? The next two questions, if the answer here is yes, we're going to ask if either person receives child care assistance through the state. And so yes or no. Do you get state child care or daycare assistance, or does the other party? And then if it is no, we're going to ask if they would be interested in a parenting conference. I'm not going to focus too much on the parenting conferences for at least fall 2023. Those aren't likely to be happening very much. So, we still want that information. That's helpful for us to know if the program needs to come back and what the demand is. But basically, a parenting conference is just like mediation light, where they sit with someone who tries to help them come to an agreement. So here, we're going to say that this was no, they couldn't agree, and no, they wouldn't be able to do a parenting conference. So then down here is the infamous chart. You're going to fill the chart for the post-judgment out at CCAP. But before you go to CCAP, you're going to want to you're going to fill the current orders out at CCAP. But before you can get those current orders, you need to fill in this chart. I guarantee you, at least 2 or 3 of you will have a moment where we say, where you come over and you say, well, I can't find their case. And I say, well, what's the other party's name? You're going to say, I didn't get that. I'm going to say, what's the child's name? You're going to say, I didn't get that. And I'm going to be like, why didn't you fill out my chart? So this you're going to fill out every time. So Susie's child is going to be Sally. I spelled Sally oddly. Sally, and it was sample MJC forms. And then the client's name. If the client's name up here was correct, then I'm okay with you just being like, oh yeah, I can get it from up there. You should, of course, fill in my chart to the fullest, but again, the client's name is kind of the one where you do have it written. If that one is correct, I'm okay with that. But do make sure you ask, have you ever gone by any other name? And she might say, oh yeah, I also used to be Susie Smith before I got married. Okay, great. So we have that information. What is the other parent's name? I'm going to say the other parent is John Doe. Has John ever gone by another name that you know of? No, not that I know of. Do you have a court case number with you? If they do, you'll write in that court case number. If they don't, we'll do it as an FA. You can get that information from CCAP. So if she had that number, great. If she said, you know what, I don't know that number, totally fine. Oh, we're not going to delete the entire row. I would just leave that blank and go get it from CCAP. The rest of this section is filled in from CCAP. So again, a lot of people will be like, is the state a party? That's not necessarily something a client's going to know. So we can get this information from the CCAP system. And you'll do that. This video isn't going to go through getting things from CCAP because, the Salesforce stuff is confidential, but we can work around it. There really isn't a good workaround for the confidential information in CCAP. So during your first shifts in the clinic, you'll get an introduction to CCAP and how to fill out this section of the fact-finding sheet. So we are, for our purposes, done with the fact-finding sheet. We're going to act like I went to CCAP. I found out that the state is a party and it was not a divorce case. It was a paternity case. And that the date of our last order was 01/02 of 2023. And custody is joint custody. Again, you shouldn't be making this up. I know I am writing it in and kind of pulling it from thin air. But that's because Susie Sample is a fake person. And so I can put fake orders for my fake person. You're going to be working with real people. And so since you are working with real people, you're going to want to get the real correct orders from the court record on CCAP. So primary placement with father, mom's placement, reasonable times, reasonable notice. And so notice I'm just putting like, all that has to happen is I have to understand this. So you don't need to write in full sentences, right? I'm, mom's placement, reasonable times, reasonable notice. I know what that means. That's really all you need from that. So I'm going to fill in the whole thing. If you have something that isn't addressed, so like if she says, yeah, I don't want to talk about arrears, or that doesn't come up, then the arrears repayment might be something that I don't end up needing to fill in. And then last but not least, any red flags or unusual facts. So it could be, I gave the example before that there's a restraining order. So I might say there's a restraining order between them. This is where you can make note of anything that you want to bring to the supervisor's attention. So in the beginning, it's going to be things you're not sure about. As you get more confident and know this process better, it's going to be things that you kind of know are a problem. And so that is the fact-finding questionnaire. After this, you are going to go ahead, check in with the supervisor, and the supervisor is going to help you use this form to determine which set of documents you need. Here, we're wanting to change an existing order. And it is changed, by the way. I know I was like, oh, if you're not sure, I am sure. She wants to lower child support. That's a change. You want to go from a higher number to a lower number, and getting more placement times. You want to go from whatever placement you have now to a new thing. Both of those are changes, right? She's saying, I don't like what my order says. I want to do something different. That's a change. So we're wanting to make a change, and the other person doesn't agree. So when you want to change and the other person doesn't agree, that's a modification. When you want to change and they do agree, that's a stipulation. When you want to enforce, that's either contempt or enforcement of placement. You don't necessarily have to remember those things. But so if when I sat down with the supervisor, they'd say, okay, it looks like change, and they don't agree. So that means that we're looking at a modification motion. So our next step is going to be to check out the filing directions for the modification. All right, so we have done our fact-finding sheet, checked in with the supervisor. We are ready to pull up a set of the filing directions to get started on the forms. And I know what you're thinking, oh my God, there are more steps. We're still not to the forms. There are a lot of different things that go into just filling out a form. So we're now going to move from Salesforce. So we've been on Salesforce. Now we're going to check out the internal forms site. Just sort of a brief introduction to this site. We call it the internal site because it is slightly different than the external public-facing site. The difference is not in the forms. You fill out the same forms as people can get publicly, but the forms that we have here are just organized slightly differently. So in this, on this front page, if for some reason you need a fact-finding questionnaire, you can find those there. Again, in person, you're going to be given a physical copy, but if, I don't know, a giant crow swoops in and steals your fact-finding sheet, I'm not sure how a giant crow got in the courthouse, but if that happens, you can pull up another one here. And it also, every page has the fee waiver because that is the most common document we do. But otherwise, from this landing page, you can see, based on what category of case, what forms you'll go to. So each button will take you to a different set of forms. Often, this is going to reflect what is on your fact-finding sheet. So again, our fact-finding sheet tells us that our case is a post-judgment case, so we'll want to be looking at the post-judgment forms. If you had a divorce part 1, you would go to this set of documents. Part 2 over here. If you're working with a client who speaks Spanish, there are some forms that are available in Spanish, particularly divorce forms, so you can check those specific forms. Service forms, we have name change forms, lots of different sets of forms. The green forms are forms that you may be using, these blue-green forms. These darker forms are used for some of our other clinics. So unless you're in like the expungement pardon clinic or the adult guardianship clinic, you won't use these in the normal family forms clinic. So since we know we have a post-judgment case, we're going to go ahead and go to the post-judgment family tab. And you can see we've gotten to this site here. Sorry, I'm moving my cat again. My cat has been a real guest in these videos this week. Okay. So we're in the post-judgment family section. Again, at the top, it has the fee waiver, and it also has some service options information. This can be useful. So a few things that you can look at before you fill out the form. One is service options. So if you have a case where maybe the supervisor said, I think they might have trouble with service, you might want to pull up this set of service options and review them. Right? This has lots of information. It's written as if it's being given to a client, but it's lots of great information that will answer questions that people might have for you, right? For a motion, how long do I have to get the other person served? You have until 5 business days before your hearing. Where do I take a copy of the document? I take it to room 707. What are my options? You could try through the sheriff. If they live outside Milwaukee, it gives how much it costs. And so this is a gold mine of information for you. And so a lot of those questions where you're like, well, I don't know, this is going to answer those. So the service options sheet, which is part of the filing directions, very helpful, especially if you have someone who you think is going to have service issues. The other thing that you'll want to look at before you start filling out the form. So the service options, that's something you might pull up before you're sitting with the client, or you might pull it up after you've filled out the form if you know that you're going to have trouble serving, or the client is going to have trouble serving. But with the client sitting here, what I usually do is pull up a set of filing directions and print them off. What the filing directions have for you that's very useful is they tell you which forms you need. Now, I know for the modification, which is the one we're using as our sample in this case, in this training, you need one form plus the fee waiver. That's not something that is super difficult, but there are some cases where there are a lot more forms. So, for example, if we were doing a divorce part 2, and let's say we're doing it separately with minor children, I can pull that up and you can see, look, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different things the client needs. That's really hard to keep track of just in your head. And I know you're all like, oh, I'm a superstar. I can totally remember that. Again, there are different ways to file and different, there are 4 different kinds of part 2s, and there's this and there's that. And so you're going to end up wanting the filing directions to make sure we're getting the right information. And so for me, just to make sure I'm in the habit of it, I pull this up even if it only has a couple of forms listed, like the modification. And I print it out so I have a hard copy. This also is really helpful because one of the common questions people will have is, how much does it cost? And we have that information here. And then basic directions about where they take them. We'll go through that at the end because we will revisit the filing directions at the end. So at the beginning, I use the filing directions to see what forms I need. At the end, I use it to tell the client where to go next. So looking at our filing directions here, we need the Notice of Motion and Motion to Change form FA 4170V. So I am back to the internal form site. I'm looking through the forms down here. Oh, well, I'm in the part 2 site. I'm going to go back to the post-judgment site. So I'm down here and I'm looking for the motion, Notice of Motion and Motion to Change. We use a nickname for that or a short form name, the modification, but you see that the form number is the same. So if I went, is a modification the same thing as that motion to change? I could go ahead and pull this up and go, okay, it says I need 4170V. And I could double check here, 4170V. Okay, great. So they're the same form. What some people will do that is a mistake, so don't do this, is they will go, oh, these two are together, so obviously I must do this one too. Well, if I look at my directions here, it doesn't list that one. There can be a reason for that. So if you have a question like that, if you're like, why is that there? Should I be doing that? You can definitely ask a supervisor, but don't assume just because they're all in order on the website that you need to do all of them. For example, I'm going to go back to that part 2 section. All of these are in order, but I do not necessarily need these for all kinds of these aren't necessarily all the documents I need. I will need some of them in some cases, some in others. I'll need to mix in some of these. And so if you just went straight down this line, you would not have done all the documents you need to do. So make sure you're pulling up those filing directions to tell you what set of forms to do. So we know from our filing directions that we're doing that modification form, this 4170V. I'm going to open that one up. And then we'll be on to our next one, where we're going to work on filling out the form itself. All right, guys, it is the moment you have all been waiting for. Hours and hours into the training, we are finally going to fill out a form. There are lots of forms that we do. Obviously, we do part 1, part 2, 4 different kinds of post-judgment. We do name changes. We're just going to go through the modification motion in this training. 2 reasons for that. The first reason is because, as you guys know from the email you received, hopefully, there is a training exercise where we have you do a practice form. The practice form that we have you do is a modification. So that's one reason. The other is that the modification is probably the most common form that we do. And the third reason is that divorces are a little bit more intuitive, I think. Some of the questions they're asking, like, have you lived in Milwaukee County for 30 days? Like, that's something that you can just sort of see and understand and know what to fill in there. Versus the modification can be a little bit trickier. If you would like to see some of those other forms, in our supplemental materials on the training site, there are video tutorials on filling out almost all of the forms. Those tutorials are designed for clients. So, right, it's done as if someone were filling the form out themselves. But great news, that's effectively what you're doing. You're helping clients fill the forms out themselves. And so the information in that is going to be very similar to the information that I'm, say, giving you here, or that you would get on, if I did tutorials specifically for volunteers. It's just framed slightly differently because obviously those other videos are saying you and your spouse as opposed to the client or the client's spouse. But the information is still basically the same. So if you're interested in seeing more forms, then you can definitely check that out in our supplemental materials. But right now, we are going to help Susie sample MJC forms fill out her form. So we start at the very top. We're going to put in the county. The county is almost always going to be Milwaukee for us. Every now and then you will get somebody from another county. So if your client comes in and they say, oh, actually my case is out in Waukesha, we will put Waukesha there. That's something you always want to flag for the supervisor. So if your client comes in and they do not have a Milwaukee County case, make sure that you're letting the supervisor know. The next part of the caption, the top part of the form here, you'll either check marriage. So if the client is wanting to change something out of their divorce case, you'll check marriage. If their case was a paternity case, then you'll check paternity of, and you're going to put the child's initials here. And that was... and that's, I never know with the hyphenated names. Sometimes I put in the hyphen, sometimes we just do like that. Because again, remember the child is Sally, sample MJC forms. But I'll do the hyphen this time. With post-judgment cases, so this is not true in divorces. If you are starting a divorce brand new, it will be the name of the person who is sitting with you will be the petitioner and their spouse will be the respondent. But in post-judgment cases where we are changing or enforcing an existing order, the caption is going to be the same as it was for the very original filing in the case. Think of it as the like the title page of a book, right? So the title of the book is Mom v. Dad. That title of the book stays the same, even if we are now in the chapter, Dad asks for something or Mom enforces something. No matter what, it'll be Mom or name v. name. The reason why I'm defaulting and going Mom v. Dad is the vast majority of the cases we work with are started by the state of Wisconsin. And I know you're going, oh my God, how do I put the state there? And that for shorthand, when the state starts a case, they always call it State of Wisconsin versus Mom and Dad. And so for filling out this form, when the state is a petitioner, which is almost always in our clinics, it's mom's name first, dad's name second. So for you as a volunteer, what does that mean? That means in a post-judgment case, usually you should check in the computer, that CCAP computer, but usually mom's name first, dad's name second. Only post-judgment, not true when you're starting a divorce brand new. So here, we're going to assume that followed our usual format here. So it was Susie's name first. MJC forms. I really want to put MJC divorce, that email, instead of MJC forms. And we'll put her mailing address. I think we said it was West East Street. Obviously, again, we've talked about this. Cindy is a fictional person. So what that means is if I'm getting things wrong, well, she's not a real person. But when you're working on this with a client, you want to make sure, okay, and just to remind me, your address was 1234 West East Street. Do I have that right? Is it 53209? Sometimes it's helpful to write that information down because you're going to have to put the address in multiple places. So to go ahead, write it down so you can have it to keep entering, because you're going to have to enter it a lot of different times. And then we're going to put her phone number here. I'm not going to overload you too much because I feel myself wanting to say, now, what do I do if they say they don't want to list their address? What do I do if this? What do I do if that? We're just going to do the major things that you'll run into in most or many cases. But those little nuanced things, again, are all good things to bring to the attention of the supervisor. So if I'm filling out this form and Susie says, oh, I don't want to list my address, then what you can do is, if it is a question where you cannot go forward on the form without answering it, go up and ask the supervisor first. But if it's something where you could finish the form, so let's make it a little simpler. Let's say Susie says, I don't want to list my phone number. I'm okay with listing my address, but I don't want to list my phone number. You can still finish the form, right? You could leave that blank, and then you could make a note for yourself, handwritten note, in your fact-finding sheet or anywhere else that says, does she need to include a phone number? Question mark. You could put a little sticky note on the form here to remind you to ask about that. But then you can keep filling out the form. And so what I would do is I would put a sticky note here to remind me to ask, does she have to put a phone number? And then keep filling out the form. But if Susie's question is, well, with my current order, if I left it that way, can I just blah, blah, blah? That is something where it sounds like maybe she doesn't want to do the form, or maybe she needs legal advice. So that kind of thing would be something where you would come up and ask the supervisor before. That nuance, again, can be really difficult to master. So when in doubt, it's always worth asking. But just know that just because you have a question, sometimes you can just ask them all at the end, and that's a little bit more efficient. Then we're going to go ahead and put in the other person, who I think was John Doe. A really common issue we see in our clinics is people will say, hey, what do I do if I don't know my spouse's or my ex's address? For filling out a post-judgment form, again, for divorces, this is not true. We're just talking about post-judgment. For a post-judgment form, we can leave the other person's address blank on the form. So they'll have issues with service. That's where you'll be wanting to talk to the supervisor about those service options. But as far as filling out the form itself, we can leave the other person's address blank. You'll indicate whether or not the state is a party. Spoiler, in almost all of our cases, they are a party. And then over here, we're going to check the things that the client wants to talk about. So if they want to talk about, again, we remember from our fact-finding sheet, now you see why I made you do some of these. Cindy wants to talk about child support, placement, and legal custody. So we'll talk about legal custody, placement, and child support. And if down the line something changes, so let's say originally she just wanted to talk about custody and placement, but then as we're going through the form, she says, oh, I also want to talk about child support. Don't forget to come back and add it to the caption up here. Here we're going to include Susie's, God, I use Cindy and Susie sample, and I really should just pick one because now I'm mixing them up. Susie, we're going to put Susie's case number here. As you may recall from our fact-finding sheet, the number Susie gave us had a 40 at the beginning. See this 40? That 40 is actually a county code. It tells the Office of Child Support what county the case is in, because the Child Support Office has access to statewide records. The courts only have access to Milwaukee County records because they don't need the other state stuff. So we'll just take the numbers after the 40. So do not include the 40 in your caption here. So then we're going to put that case number there. And then in the notice section will always include the name of the other party. So it's always going to include the other parent. The other thing that it could include is if we want to talk about child support and the state of Wisconsin is a party, then we will also include the state of Wisconsin. So that is that notice section. Here, because Susie wants to change placement. So with these sections, you only fill out the ones you want. So if Susie had just wanted to do child support, we would skip placement, skip custody, go straight to child support. But she wants to talk about placement. So here, you're going to put the child's name or initials, sample MJC forms. And here, we're going to indicate first, we're going from placement with, what are we going from and what are we going to? So again, if I go back to my fact-finding sheet, which is a very useful thing we have here, we know that right now it is primary placement with dad. So if Susie is saying, yeah, I'm fine with primary placement being with dad, I just want to change the times I get to see my child, then we could go ahead and go to number 4. She just wants to change the schedule. But if it's a situation where she says, yeah, right now it's primary with dad, but I want it to be primary with me, we would do number 1. So you can see it's always saying, what are we going from and what are we going to? So we're going to go ahead and say that she would like to go from primary with dad to primary with mom. So we'll just say it was with John Doe. And then she is Susie, sample MJC forms. So we'll check that. And then no matter what, you'll also put in what schedule they want it to be. So a lot of people think this requested placement schedule only goes with number 4. But you can see the changes in 1 through 4 above. So it applies to all of them. So here, we know it's going to be primary placement with her. So we don't need to put primary again. But we do want to put placement with dad. So if primary placement is with mom, placement with dad will be, and let's say she wants it to just be the opposite of what they know. So placement with dad, reasonable times upon reasonable notice. Right? So, and it could be more specific, right? She could say placement with dad every other Thursday, every other weekend. Every other weekend. She could say we're going to alternate weeks. You know, every other weekend, and we'll say Friday, 5 p.m. to Sunday, 5 p.m. Right? So we can be as specific as we want there. If they want to be really specific, you might end up doing an attachment. If the schedule we've proposed here gives the person with less time, I know it's getting a little complicated, less than 92 overnights in the year. So dad has less time in this situation, and he is getting less than 92 overnights in a year, right? Because he gets Friday night and Saturday night every other week. 26 times 2, that is less than 92. If that's the case, we also fill out number 5, and you're going to ask the client, why is this schedule that you're proposing, why is it in the child's best interest? And so here she might say, you know, John just took a job as a long-haul trucker, and this schedule will provide our child with more stability. Great. This is one of those sections where often the client will be like, well, what do you think? What should I say? And again, we're just saying, this wants to know why this is what's best for your child. So you should just put why this schedule is what is in your child's best interests. So it can be tricky because people are like, well, it's what I want it to be, but the question is framing it a little differently, right? It's saying, why is this what's best for the child, not why is it what you want? Number 6 is only if they want placement to be supervised or unsupervised. What'll happen a lot is people will be like, yeah, I want my placement to be unsupervised. You only need to do 6 if you're changing from what it is. So if Susie's placement were currently supervised and now she wanted it to be unsupervised, or if John's placement were supervised or unsupervised, you'd use number 6. But if it's like, so right now, let's say Susie's placement is unsupervised and she wants that to continue, you don't have to do number 6. Only use 6 if it is something that is going to change. And then last but not least, we're going to indicate here whether or not the parties have ever attempted mediation. Most commonly, that's going to be no, but sometimes they'll say, yeah, I actually have tried to do mediation on this case. So that is the placement section. Then we have the legal custody section. Again, we're only doing the sections you want to talk about, but admittedly, on purpose, Susie wants to talk about a lot of things. So in addition to talking about placement, where the child lives or spends time, she also wants to talk about legal custody. Here you check the box beside B, and you're also going to put the child's name. And what can happen is if people have multiple children, so maybe Susie has 2 children, Sally and Sandy. I'm sorry, I'm getting so many names with S. Maybe she only wants to talk about Sally. So it doesn't have to be all the children in the case, just all the children they want to talk about. So custody, again, decision-making power. And we know that, again, from our fact finding, remember where I said the fact finding is your lifeline? This is why. We know it is joint decision-making. And so if she says, well, now I want it to be just sole, we would do that here. If it were sole decision-making with, say, dad, and she wanted it to be both of them could make decisions, that would be 1. So that would go here. Other, because people often go, what the heck is other? When would I ever use that? Other would be like if they wanted specific decision-making. So maybe she wanted to say joint decision-making about everything except education. For education, mom will have sole decision-making power, or, something like that. So that would be what other would be for. But usually people are picking either 1 or 2. So let's say that Susie wants it to be with her. And she's Susie sample MJC forms. And see, I've forgotten the hyphen there. All right. So that's the legal custody section. Pretty simple. The child support section, again, you're going to check C. And again, it's because it corresponds up here. So anything we have down here, we want to have filled in that section down here. Any section filled in down here, we want to have that corresponding part of the caption filled out. So with child support, we know that her current order is $100 per week, and it's paid from mom to dad. So here, child support, that is currently $100 per week. I'm telling you, those fact-finding sheets are very helpful. The deviation for health insurance, I'm not going to deep dive into. For our purposes, we're going to check A, that it doesn't deviate for health insurance. What it is basically talking about here is, did they make a change from the state standard based on the fact that one parent is paying for health insurance? Most of the time, ours are going to be A, but often clients will know if it's going to be B. So to a new amount beginning, we always put the first of the next month. So I'm going to go ahead and put September 1st of 2023. If you are watching this in the future and September 1st of 2023 is no longer the first of the next month, you want it to be the first of the next month. So as I'm doing this right now, August 18th of 2023. So the first of the next month is September 1st. But if you were doing this in, say, March of 2024, then you would be looking at, okay, April 1st of 2024. And who we want this new amount to be paid by. So even if we want the amount to be 0, we still want to put who's going to pay who, because here in this case, mom currently pays $100 per week. We're basically telling them whose payment we're trying to stop, right? So we're saying we want the payment from mom to dad to be held open, 0. Down here you have 3 options for the new payment. One is I just want it to be calculated based on the state child support standards. Two is I actually have a specific amount in mind that I would like to ask for. So I want to ask for $1 million a week. I don't know that they're going to get it, but they can propose a specific number. C is held open. Held open means 0 right now. So in our case, because Susie is now asking for the child to live with her, it seems logical to me that she would suggest that that be held open, that it be 0. She doesn't have to do that. Sometimes clients will do things that don't necessarily make sense, but that's logical to me. And since she's a fictional person, I can kind of make that up a bit. The last part here is this I request the new amount. And note that this section applies to A, B, and C. So it looks like it maybe would just apply to C, but it actually applies to all of them. And this is, again, that deviation. So what this is saying is it's a little weird with held open. But if we had checked A, it would be saying, I know the state's going to identify what the appropriate amount is, but because I'm Susie and I'm paying for health insurance, I want to get a little discount on the child support that I'm paying. So I want it to deviate downward because I'm paying for health insurance. Or if Dad were filling this out, he might say, you know what? I want it to actually go a little bit, to have it be a little bit higher because I pay for health insurance and I want Mom to pay a little bit more child support to help cover that. So that's what that bottom section is. In our case, where we're dealing with held open, probably you don't want a deviation from that because they're just asking for 0. All right, good. So we've got that. Some sections we're going to skip because we're not talking about them, at least in this motion, are the maintenance section and the arrears payment section. We don't fill those out very often, but again, if you do, you can work with the supervisor to make sure you're clear on what goes into them. And the other changes section. Again, this is sort of your basic overview, so I'll skip those. The date of the last court order. So when you were in CCAP, hopefully, you pulled the date of the most recent court order. You're going to take that and you're going to plug it in to this date of the last order line. Yeah, so you're going to plug that in. And then here, number 3, what number 3 is asking is what has changed since this date that is making the client want to change their order, right? So this form is saying, I want to do something different with my order. And here they're going to say, here's what's different that makes this old order not work anymore. So I usually go through with them and I say, we're just going to go through these to see if any of them apply. Is there a child who is living with you who's now living with the other parent? And yeah, maybe Susie says, yes, my child's been living with me since John became a trucker. Okay, so we would check A. Are any of the kids over 18 and not eligible for sport anymore? Nope, we just have the one child. Okay. Has anybody moved? Yeah, John has a new address because he's a long-haul trucker and now he lives in his truck. Okay, great, we'll check C. So you can check as many as you want. And I just, go through these with the client. It could be we don't live together anymore. It could be there is not currently a placement schedule. We can't agree. Maybe somebody's employment or work shift has changed. So we know John's employment situation has changed just a bit. Excuse me. So the employment of father has changed. And maybe his income has changed too. Maybe it's changed for both people. Maybe Mom has a new job too. So that's going to be filling out that section. And the last thing that you're going to do on this form is this substantial change section down at the bottom. And I know you're going, what the heck? Didn't we just do a substantial change section up here? We did. But what this is it's where you can explain in more detail what's going on. It's not optional, so I know some people hear that and they're like, great, we'll skip it. Even if you're just repeating something you've already set up here, you're still going to fill this section out. Because think of it as, if I say father's employment has changed, how that will impact the order will change a lot if it is he quit his job because he won the Mega Millions and became a billionaire, versus he was laid off and now is only receiving unemployment, right? That will change what that means for the case going forward. So think of this as just a short paragraph, a few sentences, where the client sort of narratively describes what's going on. This is another section that can be really dangerous on that legal advice line, because the client's going to say, well, what do you think I should say? Does that sound good? Is that right? And again, it's just we want you to say what has changed that's making the old order not work anymore. What is different since this date that makes the old order not work? So under that substantial change section, again, that's where it may have some overlap with this section too. So remember up here we talked about John taking a job as a long haul trucker. It could be that this is going to be very similar. So, this is where she could say, on April 5th, 2023, John took a job as a long haul trucker. And make sure you'll be watching for typos. Long haul trucker. Since then, he has not been in Wisconsin as much, and our child has been living primarily with me. I would, like to change the order to reflect what is happening. And then you want to address each piece. So that talks about why we want to change placement, right? So then, okay, what about decision making? Because, and sometimes there'll be an overlap. Sometimes it might be clear how that applies to custody placement. But here, if it's not immediately clear why John being a long haul trucker would affect his ability to help make decisions, it might be, because John is frequently gone, he is not able to weigh in on decisions, and maybe in several instances we have had trouble with the school because he was not around to sign off on things. Right, so just again, a rough sort of a highlight, right? Think of this as the headline, and then the court will get a little more detail at the hearing. And then child support. Again, since my child lives with me now, I no longer think I should have to pay support. Or I don't think I should have to pay support anymore. The other thing I would have you take a look at is, so it's this paragraph, but notice that I wrote it as if I were Cindy speaking. So a lot of you are going to have the impulse to say, on April 5th, 2023, the client's ex took a job, or mother's father took a job. And you can say that, but like when they're talking about themselves, so like your impulse is going to be to say, mother would like to change the order. And it's as if they're writing it, right? We know, because it's been a 3-hour plus training, that you guys do a lot of things, but you are in this section filling it out a glorified typist, right? And so it is just, when they say, well, I feel like he hasn't. The other thing I will say about this section is people really get the impulse, both students and clients, to what I call lawyer it up. So notice, like, this is not trying to use a bunch of fancy lawyer terminology, right? I'm not going, this constitutes an abandonment of one's constitutional duty of, right? It's not getting into that. It's just saying he took this job. Since then, he hasn't been here that much. So my advice to you about this section is, don't try to fancy it up. A lot of times you're going to want to be like, oh, I want to make it sound more lawyerly, or I want to make it no. We really just want it to be clear about what they're saying. I think it is much better to say, I lost my job, or the other person hasn't been paying support because they lost their job or whatever, than to say, wherefore and unto the other person shall henceforth have been in consent, right? Nobody knows what the heck you're talking about. And sometimes you're actually going to use the legal terms wrong. So my advice is don't try and make it too fancy. Just really explain clearly what's happening. And you may be saying, well, explain clearly. What if the client's not clear? To the degree it's necessary to clarify, you can sort of say or help them adjust things. So again, if the client says, well, he went to the place where he did the thing, you could say, like, okay, when you say the place, did he go out of the state or where did he go? Right? And they say, well, he went to Kentucky. Oh, so John went to Kentucky. And you can write that in. And did the thing. Did he take a job? Yeah. He became a trucker. Again, you could clarify that to say, their original sentence was he went to the place to do the thing. You could say John, and you clarified, went to Kentucky to take a job as a trucker, right? So you are able to ask questions, especially like if you're confused, then probably the court will be confused too. So you can use that information to make it clearer. And then last but not least, you're going to fill out this signature block down here. Obviously the client needs to sign, but you will put their name down here. And then you will put the address, which should match up top. And so one thing you can do is copy paste from the top here down there. And choose Glendale, Wisconsin 53209. And so again, you'll put this in if a client doesn't have an email address. So if they're like, yeah, I don't use email, you can just leave that blank. And then the phone number, and I want the phone number to match this one here. There we go. And then you would print this off, take it to the, excuse me, you would print this off and take it to the supervisor. The supervisor would take a look at it and they would go through it with you to discuss things that were wrong. So it could be things where you have questions. So again, if you had said, oh yeah, she doesn't want to list her phone number, is that okay? That would be something you could discuss with a phone number. She doesn't have his address, is that a problem? Right? They would discuss sort of what that means. But then they'll go through it with you. Sometimes they might have adjustments. So if I had forgotten to fill out section 5, the supervisor might say, you need to fill out this number 5 and put that information. So once you're done with this and the supervisor's looked it over, they'll give you some edits. You'll come back to your station. You'll make some edits. But then at some point, you're going to have a form where the supervisor has approved it. And they've said, yep, that looks good. You're good to go on to the next step. So then at that point, some things that obviously I'm not going to show you in this video, you're going to get the client to sign this. You're going to make some photocopies. And your question might be, well, how do I know how many copies? Aha, remember those filing directions? Those filing directions have the information about the number of photocopies that you need. So here we can see we need 5 copies of the modification motion. So you'll get the client to sign, then make copies. Don't make copies and then have them sign because that's a pain in the butt. You'll get them to sign, you'll make the copies. Another form that we may fill out is a fee waiver. And so that's why it's a good thing to come back here because see, in doing this video, almost forgot the fee waiver. But because I have my handy dandy filing directions, I noticed that, oops, I don't have a fee waiver. So many of our clients receive food share or badger care or just aren't able to pay the filing or service fees. If they receive food share or badger care, they qualify automatically for a fee waiver. If they don't receive those but want to ask for a fee waiver, they still can ask. The court just gets to decide whether or not to say yes. So we'll go ahead and look at the filing directions. I know I love them so much, but what I usually do is I show the client and I say, hey, there is a $50 because our client wants to change custody placement and child support. There is a $50 fee associated with filing this motion, and there might be additional fees for service. Do you get food share or badger care? And if she says yes, then I would say, great. That means that you qualify automatically for a fee waiver. If you want, we can fill that form out so you can ask the court not to make you pay these fees. If she says, no, I don't want to do that, she doesn't have to. Not required, even if they qualify. Or if, let's say, she says, no, I don't get food share, badger care, or anything like that, then I would say you're still allowed to ask for a fee waiver. Generally speaking, the further you are from qualifying for public assistance, the harder it is to get a fee waiver, but it's up to you whether or not you want to ask. And that may be a point where they're going to say, well, do you think I'll get it? Or how likely is it they'll get it? And that's when you can say, again, the most I can kind of give you is that usually the further you are from public benefits, the harder it is to qualify because it is based on the poverty level. And then at that point, they'll either decide to do it or not. But since our situation, I think we said that Susie gets food share, we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at that fee waiver. Excuse me. The fee waiver has two different pieces to it. So from our filing directions, we can see this CV410A, CV410B. And those are both listed here. So we'll pull up the first one. And you'll fill out the top. Oh, I'm going to click on it so I'm actually on it. Milwaukee County. And the names we have. This will mirror what you've done on the forms up to this point. So the top section of our motion, right, is Susie first, John second. And so that is going to continue to be true on our fee waiver. And that's true, again, even if John is the one asking for a fee waiver, that would still be the order. So go John Doe. And we're going to put this in the case number. Down here, you're going to check this box. It's just saying they're not able to pay the filing or service fees. And then the vast majority of our clients fall into Section 1. So as I mentioned, in this training, we're going to do sort of the most common, and then you'll work your way through and learn more complicated things in the clinic. Here, so if Susie receives food share and badger care, I'm going to check food share and medical assistance. If she just got badger care, just medical assistance. If she just gets food share, just food share, but you can check both. And then you'll indicate whether or not her financial situation has changed since her last review for that program. So we'll say has not. If it is has, then the next question is like, would you still be eligible if you applied today? So if she gets food share and she says, yeah, my situation changed. I actually lost my job. I make less money than I used to. She wouldn't have to do Section 2. But if she says, yeah, I won the Mega Millions last night, her situation has changed, and she would do the second section here because she might not be eligible for that program anymore. If someone is not, checks has, and they might not be eligible anymore, or if they don't have anything in Section 1, you fill out Section 2. I'm not going to go through that on the training because, again, the vast majority of our clients are filling out Section 1. And then down here, you fill in the signature block. Notice from our terminology, this is a notary block. So with the notary block, all you have to fill in is the state and the county. The notary will fill in everything else. Some of you will be tempted to, and do not do this, to fill in the names. You'll go, you know what? Kyla is the supervisor today. So I'm going to put Kyla's name. But then it actually becomes a problem because Kyla's busy, and so you go to Natalie and you say, hey, Natalie, can you supervise? Or I'm sorry, can you notarize? But then it's got Kyla's name on it. So, or you put Kyla, but actually Kyla's notary stamp says Kyla N. Moats, and then it doesn't work. So leave the line blank. Just put the state and the county. And then that's all you do for the notary block, but over on the signature block, we're going to put in the client's information again. You're going to get so tired of writing the client's information again and again. But that is why it can sometimes be a good idea to write down their information so you have it at a glance and you can just go, oh, yeah, that's right. I know their address. East Street. Fine. I know, ton of fun watching me type here. And Susie sample. All right, so that is all for this first page of the fee waiver. And then you will go to the form site and get the second page of the fee waiver. The second page of the fee waiver is pretty simple. It's just the caption. So I'm going to very quickly put in, excuse me, Susie's information here. Susie sample, MJC forms. And the other party in Susie's case as well. We'll put in her case number here. And on this line, this is the person who is asking for the fee waiver. So since right now we're working with Susie and not John, that will be Susie's information there. All right, and that's all for that one. So now we're going to go back to the filing directions. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. We're going to go back to the filing directions to figure out what the next steps are, how many copies we need, and what the next steps are for the client. And we are back to my beloved filing directions. As I said, it tells you the costs, so that can help you fill out the fee waiver, as I almost forgot to do. It tells you the forms that you need. So here you can use this to double check and make sure you've done all the forms that you need to. We have now done the motion, the fee waiver, and both parts of the fee waiver. Awesome. Again, you had the client sign everything, went and made copies. Then the filing directions are also a tool for your client to know where they have to go next. So you will explain to the client the next steps. What I recommend when you're new is having a copy of the filing directions, printing 2 copies basically. So you can have one copy that is facing the client, so it's right side up for them and they can read it, and one copy for the client or for you that's in front of you so you can read it, so you don't have to read it and point to things upside down. As you get more experienced, it'll get to a point where you can do it upside down and it's not that difficult. But at first, it's really hard trying to read it and also have it upside down and highlight things and make note. So when you're reviewing this with the client, you don't have to read it verbatim. Here's somewhere where you really can sort of, get the highlights and give sort of the basic gist. If the client is doing a fee waiver, sometimes we can deal with the entire fee waiver in our clinic. So we have some folks on our staff who are authorized to approve the fee waivers. If you're able to notarize it and get it approved, great. They can skip all of Section A. If not, you'll just explain the next steps. So again, you don't have to read this whole thing. If I were doing this with a client, I would just say, yeah, so you need to take that fee waiver up to room 104 to get it notarized. Make sure you'll want to have your ID with you, because that's why we couldn't do it today, is because you didn't have a photo ID. And then you'll take your proof of public assistance, so that food share app on your phone, and you can take that up to room 609 to get it approved. And if I were doing this physically in person, I would try and highlight each of the places they had to go, right? So I would highlight 609. I would highlight 104 up here because there are a lot of words on this sheet. It's very busy. And so I find that people sometimes find it helpful if you can highlight specifically where they need to go. And then section 2, which is a little bit clearer, I think, is walking them through what rooms they need to go to file it. So once they have the fee waiver approved, or if they're not using a fee waiver, where do they go? And so again, if I were walking someone through this, I would just hit the highlights. I would say, okay, to file this, you're going to start in 104. That's the clerk of court's office. You'll give the clerk all of the documents and show them your fee waiver so that you don't have to pay the filing fee. Then they're going to stamp the documents. They'll give some of them back to you. You're going to take the remaining documents up to room 707. In 707, you're going to get your court date. They'll write the hearing on the first one. Make sure if they don't write it on the subsequent copies that you add it to all the copies. And then since you're wanting to talk about child support, you'll take a copy of this motion to room 101. That's child support services. And yeah, so then you do need to get the other person served. And side note for you, my student friends, this is where hopefully you'll have talked with the supervisor some about service. And so hopefully we'll have talked to the client about here's how we plan to serve. So again, hope this is a conversation that this shouldn't be new information for them. So as we talked about, you can take that over to the sheriff. They're in room 102 of the safety building, so just upstairs and then ways down the hallway in a different building, but you don't have to actually leave the building. You just have to walk down that hallway. And give them a copy to get the other person served. And then once you've done that, just once you get your proof of service back, you'll want to make sure that you submit that document in room 707 before your hearing. Any questions about that? Right? And so then I've reviewed this with the client. Usually it's pretty self-explanatory. And again, I would highlight it's because I'm doing this on the computer where it's thinking I want to edit it. It's harder to highlight, but you, my friends, are going to be doing this by hand, so you will just pull out a highlighter and highlight each of the rooms that they're going to go to and any key information. So that's where you get your court date. You don't necessarily have to, I tend to. So each of those steps, just again, because in this busy page, we want them to be able to see what's really important. So then that is using those filing directions to explain the next steps. After this, you're going to walk your client out of the clinic. Again, you want to actually walk them out, not say, great, there's the door, bye. And then once the client is gone, you have a couple of last things before you're ready to take another client. The first thing is you're going to go to this Salesforce profile that you created in the beginning, and we're going to create a new visit. So you can see periodically we have visits for our sample one. You don't need to go into this old visit. You're going to create a new visit because it is not January of 2023. This is time for a new visit. So I'm going to show you this the way I do it. You can do them in any order. Some people go straight down one side, straight down the other. You'll see I ping pong back and forth. That's not too important. So for the service type, you'll indicate whether that was a part 2 or a form, or very rarely an application for child support services. And we're not even going to get into that in the training because that's such a rare form that we do. So this was not a part 2, so it was general forms. Type of case, we did a post-judgment. So again, this should correlate pretty strongly with what is on your your fact-finding sheet. And then the specific type of forms. That's where I say we did a modification form. Again, this should be what's on your fact-finding sheet. This one should be what's on your filing directions. If for some reason you didn't do a form, so maybe Susie, I really do have 2 sample people and I need to give them different names. Susie, our client for this training, came in, and let's say that after talking to you, talking to the supervisor, we determined we couldn't do a form and what she needed was legal advice. In that situation, you would not have a type of form here. You would just put none. You're pretty much always going to have a type of case because, again, even if we said we can't help you, it would be a case type, but it was just a situation we couldn't help. You never need to change the status, by the way. I know often when, say, again, Susie came in and we said, oh, because of this, you need to get legal advice. We can't help you. You don't change the status up here. This is all stuff that is done by the supervisor if it needs to be changed. For your purposes, it's always going to be the default completed scene. So again, type of form, since we did a form, we're going to put modification. For you guys, the location is always going to be MJC Forms. That will always be the location, MJC Forms in person. Volunteer, you're just going to put your name. It can just be your first name. It doesn't need to be your whole name unless you have an unusual name, or not an unusual name, you have a fairly common name. For example, this most recent semester, we had 5 people named Grace. That's totally fine. Grace is a fine name. But that meant that our Graces needed to put their first initial. So if either I know my name is very common, or if I, in clinic, if the supervisors are always calling me Kyla M, or, as opposed to Kyla Q, then I know I should put my first initial, or possibly your whole name. Again, in our situation where we had 5 Graces, we also had a few with the same first initial. So you might hit a point where you're putting your whole name, but don't need to, just enough that we know who you are. You'll indicate how the scope of services was done. If you provided it yourself, student volunteer. If you forgot, I had a moment where I was supposed to do it and I didn't, you'll put not provided. For me, I would put SAB or staff because I am a staff member and I went through that with our fictional client. But for you, you would be putting student volunteer. Fee waiver. The fee waiver, did you complete one? We did. So we'll put that there. This is an annoying section that I'm hoping by the time you guys are in clinic will be gone. But this is an old section we don't need. So you can put your initials. You can put ... You can put N/A. This forms complete and accurate is a required box. You can see by that little red line, but it is not one I actually care about. So you can put whatever you need to block that section off so it doesn't tell you can't fill that in. So you will put in the case number. You're going to do that anytime we know the case number. So if you're doing a name change or a divorce, you might not know the case number. But for any time you're doing a post-judgment or a divorce part 2, there is a case number and you should put that case number in. Sometimes you'll have sections that aren't fillable. That just tells you it is not something that is needed for your type of form. Over here, legal issue. What topics did they want to talk about in their motion? So she wanted to talk about child support, custody placement. So those were our topics. And then notes. So the client notes, in your supplemental materials, there are some more details on the case notes. But basically think your case notes, even in a very simple case, should be at least a paragraph. So I usually start with what the client came in to do. And I should note, in the clinic, there are little notebooks at your stations, and they do have some general questions to ask yourself to fill out this section. But what did they come in to do? So I would say client came into, and a note on terminology, I call them client. That's just how I identify them, right? Client, child, I talk about like how they're relevant to this case. But you could also use names. So like, somebody might say Susie came in to do this, or somebody else might say Miss Sample MJC Forms came in to do this. Those are all fine. The clients do, in theory, have access to this. So if they request a copy of the notes, they can see them. So you want to be polite, but it doesn't, again, you can say client, that's what I do. You can use names, anything that just sort of tells us how they fit into things. So the client came in to, and again, you want to use full sentences, things like that, came in to change her placement and child support. Yeah, so that's what she came in to do. If we weren't able to do this, I would explain why. So, if we hadn't filled it out, I would say we weren't able to fill out a form because this, we referred her to legal advice, we did that. In our situation, we filled out a form. So I would say what form we completed. We filled out a modification form. You would put any concerns that came up. So if a supervisor came over and talked to her, you would definitely want to put some notes about what was said. So I might say the client's last order is very recent, less than 6 months old. And the supervisor told her that she faces a higher legal standard. They recommended getting legal advice about what evidence she would need at her hearing. And then if we referred somewhere specific, so we recommended getting legal advice, we referred her to the MVLC. And as you get deeper into the internship, this will get easier. In the beginning, you're going to be like, oh, they came over and they talked a bunch. I don't know what they said. Try and do your best to paraphrase, but you can also go up to the supervisor and say, hey, that thing you were telling her about the order being too recent, what was that? I just want to make sure my notes are clear. And the supervisor can definitely clarify that for you. So yeah, so you can see it's basically a paragraph. If you take a look at those samples in the supplemental materials, you'll see sometimes it might be as short as this paragraph that I've written here. Sometimes it will be a bit longer. And you'll also want to address service. So she planned to serve through the sheriff. Things we want to do in this section, you want to remain factual. So notice this is all about here's what we said, here's what we did. We don't want to put in judgments or opinions. So she seemed nice. That's great, but it's not necessarily something you need to put. She seemed like a real train wreck. Also don't want to put, I think that she was drunk. Again, you don't want to put in those conclusions. You could put in facts. So if something is relevant that, maybe your client did seem like they were under the influence, you could say, she was slurring her words and I kept getting a whiff of alcohol. Again, that's something where if you're going to say they're drunk, I would check with the supervisor. But if you do need to put in something like that, we want to stay factual, right? Not like she seemed like she was drunk as a skunk, but she was slurring a little bit and she kept falling asleep while we were talking. Those sorts of things could be relevant to put in. We said this, or the client left without completing the forms. The client yelled, I don't want to have to do this, and left. That's just factual. But you don't want to say, the client got very upset and angry and stormed out like a mean person, right? That has a bunch of judgments and value sort of thoughts about, he was upset. Well, you don't know if they were upset. They stormed out, right? That kind of gives a bias to how they left versus saying, the client stood up and said, I don't want to have to do this, or yelled, I don't want to have to do this, and left the clinic, right? That's very factual, and we want to stay factual as much as we can. You're going to indicate anywhere where you sent them. So we referred her to the MVLC for some legal advice. If you refer them somewhere other than those places, you'll write that in there. It's got the visit date information, so you all can see that I am doing this very early in the morning of when I said it would go out. So, well, not very early, but I started very early. And then whether the services were provided in English, Spanish, or other. If it's a language other than English, it'll have you do some follow-up. So with Spanish, if you're the student, you might say, the student was doing it. If the client brought a family member or friend with them, you could click that one. If you have to use the language line. Or if there is a court-paid interpreter. I know it's weird because it says Marquette, and obviously ours are through the courts, but if there's a formal interpreter at the thing, that will be that one. If you do a language other than English and Spanish, then it will want to know who interpreted as well. And so again, if you are someone who speaks a language other than English or Spanish, it could be that you were doing that. So maybe you were doing it in Urdu or Hindi or something like that. Or it could be that they brought a friend or you were on the language line. But we did this one in English, so I'm going to go ahead and do this in English. The section down here on confident filing alone, that is something that you all may deal with once our AmeriCorps Courthouse Navigator program gets started. At least for the beginning of fall 2023, the Courthouse Navigators are not going to be a huge part of what's going on. So that is something you'll learn more about once that program gets started. But you may, right now, as we speak, that's not something you'll fill in, but it may be something that supervisors will ask you to start filling in as the semester goes on. Then you go ahead and you save your notes. And you'll see now it appears as a new visit. And if I go back to Cindy's profile, I would do that. Susie. I have said Cindy basically every time. I'm so sorry, guys. If we go back to Susie's profile, we can see that we now have that new visit loaded in. All right, so that is all. So at this point in the in-person clinic, you would go ahead, you would take any documents that you had filled in, and you would go ahead and exit out of them. So I would exit out of them, and it says, oh, do you want, we don't save anything. We exit out of all this stuff. Yep, don't need to save the filing directions. And you would shred anything. So if you had printed copies of the forms, you would go ahead and put them in the shredding bins in the clinic. All right. Well, that is all for this third video. You guys have, congratulations. You have successfully completed the training here. So a few things for your next steps. At least for the fall 2023, you do still need to complete a training scenario. So you were sent out a fact pattern, and you're going to fill out a sample form and a sample fact finding based on that information. And remember, you can find the sample fact, or you can find the fact finding sheets here on the website, and the website should be included in the training materials. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you do have questions about the training or need additional information, you can always reach out to either the person who was your contact for recruiting or to mjcdivorce@gmail.com. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing all of you at your first shifts.